Howdy folks, welcome back. Thanks for joining us again on our biology series. Today we get to talk about cellular respiration. Its chemical equation is the opposite of photosynthesis, like we've talked about previously. So we'll also throw in some talk about molecules in compounds. All right, let's do this. Science rocks.
All right, make sure to open up your Google Drive or your paper notebook for your biology notes and copy down these 24 vocabulary terms. Remember, they go in ABC order like this, and just come back later and create your own definitions of these words. Remember to always use your own words and to draw pictures. So go ahead and pause this if you need to finish writing down the terms. Okay, so we've talked about this before when we talked about photosynthesis, but to review, remember the two main processes by which organisms acquire energy and release energy are photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So remember, they're complementary to each other. So for photosynthesis, light energy is converted to chemical energy when those green plants capture the sunlight and use it to build sugars out of the carbon dioxide in water. So if you were to write the chemical equation out of that, it would be 6CO2, that's the carbon dioxide, plus 6H2O, there's your water, and it yields or produces, with the help from the energy from the sun, the glucose, which was C6H12O6, plus your oxygen gas, 6O2. Okay, so for cellular respiration, which we're going to talk about today, it's going to take those products of photosynthesis and use those as the reactants. All right, so cellular respiration is going to start off with glucose, the C6H12O6, and the oxygen gas, okay? And it's going to produce or yield the items that are needed for photosynthesis. So they are flip-flopped from each other. So it's going to produce the 6CO2, carbon dioxide, plus 6H2O, there's your water, plus it's going to release energy in the form of ATP. All right, so today we're going to talk more about cellular respiration. When oxygen is available, many organisms perform this cellular respiration called aerobic respiration. So during the aerobic respiration, the oxygen reacts with the glucose, okay, to produce the carbon dioxide, the water, and the ATP. A little bit more about ATP. All living organisms, including all plants and animals, perform some form of cellular respiration. So during this cellular respiration, food, like the sugar, the glucose, is converted into this ATP stuff. It's the energy currency for all cells. It's used by all living organisms to fuel their normal activities. So this ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is made up of a 5-carbon sugar called ribose. It's this section down here, and a nitrogenous base called like adenine would be this up here. And there's 3 phosphate groups, which would be this over here. So if I wanted to draw maybe like a simpler version of this ATP stuff, you would have your 3 phosphate groups, okay? And then you would have your ribose, and then you would have your adenine. Okay, so it's made up of the 3 phosphate groups, the ribose, and the adenine. Aerobic respiration. So when oxygen is available, many organisms perform aerobic respiration. I always remember it like I'm doing aerobics, I'm working out, and I'm breathing in oxygen. Okay, so you've got to do that to do aerobics. So during aerobic respiration, oxygen reacts with the glucose sugar to produce or like yield the carbon dioxide, the water, and the ATP, which is energy. So they might say cellular respiration or aerobic respiration, but it's the same old equation where it starts off with the glucose, which is the C6H12O6, plus the oxygen, and it's going to yield or produce the carbon dioxide plus the water and your ATP for energy. Okay, so if they're talking about aerobic respiration or cellular respiration, then there's your good old equation. And this is a cool picture here. In eukaryotic organisms, aerobic respiration takes place inside the organelles called mitochondria. Remember the mitochondria? And that's where ATP is produced and all that energy. That's why I call it the mitochondria. So these structures are rod-shaped with these highly folded inner membranes that allows the surface area to increase to produce more ATP. So cool picture here with the reactants coming into the mitochondria and the products being released from the mitochondria. So, oxygen is not always available. So, through aerobic respiration, like we just talked about, it's much more efficient, okay, making up to 36 to 38 ATPs per glucose molecule when you're doing aerobic respiration and when you have oxygen. Okay, so that's the aerobic respiration ATP production. But some organisms live in environments where oxygen is not abundant. Okay, so what do? These organisms undergo something called anaerobic respiration. Okay, anaerobic respiration. And it's a pathway that's very similar to aerobic respiration. It oxidizes all of the starting organic molecules into carbon dioxide and energy. Okay, so you've got carbon dioxide and energy. And anaerobic respiration, however, uses an inorganic substance like nitrate or sulfate as the final electron acceptor instead of oxygen. Okay, so they don't have oxygen, but they've got to use something. So they use this inorganic substance like nitrate or sulfate, and that allows bacteria that use this anaerobic pathway to survive in areas that are lacking oxygen. So you can see glucose entering the cell. If there is oxygen available, it'll undergo aerobic respiration in the mitochondria. If there's not oxygen available, it'll undergo anaerobic respiration, and it just won't produce as many ATP that the aerobic pathway does. Another alternative to aerobic respiration is something called fermentation. So, like anaerobic respiration, fermentation is not as efficient as aerobic respiration and results in the formation of far fewer ATP molecules. But, some organisms depend on it when oxygen is not available. So, fermentation actually takes place in the cytoplasm, in cell membranes of both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. In lactic acid fermentation, pyruvic acid, which is formed during glycolysis, so you've got glucose, and during glycolysis forms pyruvic acid. It's broken down to produce this lactic acid and ATP. Okay, so in lactic acid fermentation, it's going to produce lactic acid and ATP. An example of lactic acid fermentation occurs when muscle cells of eukaryotic organisms are depleted of oxygen. So, although this process produces energy, a buildup of this lactic acid stuff causes burning and painful sensation in your muscles. So the process is limited and the muscle cells need oxygen for sustained activity. Let's see, lactic acid fermentation also occurs in bacteria, such as those used for products like cheese, buttermilk, yogurt, so dairy products. In alcohol fermentation, you've got pyruvic acid formed during glycolysis, is broken down to produce ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide and ATP. So the pyruvic acid from glycolysis is broken down to produce ethyl alcohol plus carbon dioxide plus some ATP. So there's your products right there. Alcohol fermentation occurs in yeasts and some bacteria. So the food industry uses yeast cultures in the production of bread and in alcoholic beverages. And the agricultural industry uses yeast to produce ethanol for fuel. So there you go. There's a dependence of life on photosynthesis and respiration. Energy is cycled through ecosystems by the process of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So carbon is also cycled in the forms of carbon dioxide and glucose. Remember, carbon dioxide is CO2, there's your carbon, and glucose, C6H12O6, there's your carbon. All right. So while only plants and a few other organisms are able to perform photosynthesis, all organisms, including plants, use the sugars, that glucose, the C6H12O6, formed during photosynthesis, okay, to perform cellular respiration. All right. Organisms that cannot make their own food must eat other organisms to acquire the energy and substances they need to live and grow. So, food provides both energy and building blocks to synthesize new proteins, cells, tissues. So, it is the combined processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration that really allow organisms to grow. A little more about carbon. So, organisms use sugars not only for energy, but also to create other carbon containing molecules. Of all elements, carbon is very well suited in forming organic molecules that actually make life possible. In addition to being small and non-bulky atom that can easily bond to other atoms, carbon has 4 electrons in its outer shell, and all 4 are available for bonding. These properties allow carbon to share its electrons via single bonds with up to 4 atoms, or via multiple bonds with up to 2 other atoms to form large, stable structures. All right, friends, make sure to take a look at this video sometime explaining more about ATP and cellular respiration and take more notes. Now for some practice questions. Number 1, during the process of photosynthesis, plants use energy from the sun to convert carbon dioxide and water into glucose and oxygen. These products are, in turn, used by the plants or animals that eat the plants during cellular respiration to produce ATP. ATP molecules store cellular energy. When phosphate groups are removed and molecules of ADP are formed, energy is released. This energy can be used to perform what? Okay, so the energy used from an ATP molecule, can it be used to perform diffusion, electron transport, osmosis, or cellular work? So when a phosphate group is removed from an ATP molecule, and I'm not sure if we talked about that or not, but you've got these phosphate groups on your ATP molecule. Remember, we did a simple picture, okay? When one of those phosphate groups is removed, that's when energy is released and can be used. So when a phosphate group is removed from an ATP molecule, a molecule of ADP is formed, okay, ADP, and energy is released. So it can be used by the cell to perform cellular work, such as obtaining, transforming, or transporting materials and eliminating waste. So ATP, the energy from it, is all about being able to perform cellular work. So D. Number 2, a student isolates an unknown bacterial sample from the bottom of a swamp area. The student discovers that this species of bacteria is able to live and grow in an oxygen-free environment, but it requires a nitrate-rich soil. Which of the following respiration pathways is this species of bacteria most likely using? So you might pause this and think about it on your own. All right, if a species of bacteria is able to live and grow in an oxygen-free environment but requires nitrate-rich soil, it must be using one of the anaerobic pathways of respiration that we talked about. Okay, remember, if oxygen is not available, anaerobic, without oxygen. So, anaerobic respiration, remember, is a pathway that's very similar to aerobic respiration. It oxidizes all of the starting organic molecules into the carbon dioxide and energy, but it uses an inorganic substance like nitrate or sulfate as the final electron acceptor instead of oxygen. So that allows the bacteria that use this pathway to survive in areas like this that are lacking oxygen. So number 2 would be C, anaerobic respiration. Number 3, organisms undergo many different processes in order to be able to store energy and utilize that energy. Through which of the following processes is energy released in the form of ATP? Okay, so if you remember what we've been talking about, cellular respiration, the equation is C6H12O6, so it's that glucose, okay, plus the oxygen gas, and it's going to produce or yield the 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 H2O, which is your water, plus, and then actually 36 ATP. All right, so number 3 is going to be D. Remember, plants store energy in the form of glucose through the process of photosynthesis, and then that energy in the form of ATP is released during cellular respiration. Number 4, yeast contained in bread dough performs fermentation, which causes the bread to rise. So, which gas released by the yeast causes the bread to rise? All right, so you might pause this and think about it. If you go back to your alcohol fermentation notes, you'll see that yeast, such as those added to bread dough, are able to perform something called ethyl alcohol fermentation. So this process consumes glucose molecules and produces carbon dioxide, ethyl alcohol, and ATP. So the gas it's referring to would be the carbon dioxide, so B. On to number 5. Which of these is the main difference between aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration? So go ahead and pause this and look at your choices. Okay, aerobic respiration cannot occur without oxygen. Aerobic respiration has to have oxygen. Remember, we talked about doing aerobics and breathing in oxygen, and that's how I remember it. Anaerobic respiration occurs in the absence of oxygen. So, both processes consume glucose, they both produce ATP and release energy. All right, so that's going to cross off your other choices, and you are stuck with A. Anaerobic respiration does not require oxygen. Number 6, during photosynthesis, plant cells take in water and carbon dioxide and release oxygen. So, how is this different from what takes place during aerobic respiration or cellular aerobic respiration? Okay, so you might pause this and look over your choices. Okay, it's important to probably write down the cellular respiration, the aerobic respiration chemical equation. All right, so it starts off with glucose, so you've got C6H12O6. All right, you're going to add to it that oxygen gas, and it's going to produce or yield the carbon dioxide and water. And last but not least, ATP, energy. Okay, so when you're looking at your choices, I think this will help. Let's just look at look at A. During aerobic respiration, the mitochondria form carbon dioxide during the process of fermentation. But wait a minute, fermentation was when we talked about anaerobic respiration. Okay, so that doesn't even make sense. B, during aerobic respiration, cells use ATP, but wait a minute, it's producing ATP to convert insulin into glucose and carbon dioxide. All right, that's like all messed up with our equation. So that does not make sense. And if we look at C, during aerobic respiration, oxygen is inhaled and carbon dioxide and water are exhaled. And you're like, well, it's the right things on the right side of the equation. So you're like, let's look at D. During aerobic respiration, cells take in oxygen, yes, and release carbon dioxide, yes, water, yes, and ATP, yes. Okay, so I think D stands out to us for the correct answer choice. Last one, number 7, and I put this one on here for a reason. Notice how long this question is, okay? Sometimes you're going to get to long science biology questions, and you've got to just take your time, read through it, read through all your answer choices, and just spend that time on the question, okay? Don't just guess because it's so long. You really need to take a moment, take your time, and get through the question. So, number 7, a researcher performed an experiment in which he exposed young corn plants to a harmless radioactive form of carbon dioxide gas containing carbon-14 instead of carbon-12. He then began feeding corn produced by the plants to a small group of goats. After several weeks, the researcher took blood and tissue samples from the goats. He was able to detect increased concentrations of carbon-14 in the goats' lipids, proteins, carbohydrates, and DNA. So, which statement best explains the researcher's findings? And it's a good idea if you want to take some little notes, draw pictures, whatever about this. So go ahead and pause it and look over all 4 of these answer choices. Okay, so the researcher concluded that carbon atoms found in the sugar molecules of corn were used by the goats' bodies to form other large molecules. Okay, so we're going to go with B. All right, sugar molecules contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. So when an organism's body breaks these sugar molecules down into their components, the resulting carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms may combine with atoms of other elements. All right, so large molecules such as amino acids, which form proteins, and nucleic acids like DNA and RNA, okay, deoxyribonucleic acid, these are produced in this way. So if you look at the other answer choices like A, eating corn containing radioactive carbon-14 caused many of the goat's other carbon atoms to become radioactive. Okay, that's not even mentioned up in here. All right, so that should be able to cross off A. And then if we look at C, uptake of radioactive carbon dioxide gas caused carbon atoms to be found in places they wouldn't have normally been found. All right, and if you look through this again, nothing like that was mentioned. All right, and then D, like the corn plants, the goats experience prolonged exposure to carbon dioxide gas containing carbon-14. All right, and same thing, it doesn't speak of that up here. All right, so the only thing it really talks about are the increased concentration in the goat's lipids, proteins, carbohydrates, and DNA. And you would just have to put together that carbon atoms are found in these sugar molecules, all right, and they form these other larger molecules, all right? Woohoo, we did it. So, after fully covering the topic of cellular respiration, you should be able to create a project, a presentation, an experiment, something to show your teacher that you are a cellular respiration master. So, I challenge you to go ahead and do that.